Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the History Cloak channel. I'm Mr. McGee. We have reached the level that we've all waited for, the Battle Royale. George Washington and the Continental Army versus the most powerful military in the world at that time, England. Let's begin. Now, in the last episode, we talked about the fact that the Revolutionary War had already started at the Battle of Concord and Lexington on April 19th, 1775. Now that the war has started, the Continental Congress needed to meet again to determine who was going to lead the Continental Army and where they were going to get soldiers from. So, on May 10th, 1775, the Continental Congress met for a second time. By the way, this is why they're called the Second Continental Congress. They met for a second time in Philadelphia, and they voted for a Continental Army, and they also voted for the commander-in-chief of that army, a man named George Washington. His previous experience and his character all led to him being the obvious selection to be the overall leader of the Continental forces against England. Now, before we get started, we need to make one special note. What is a Continental Army? Now, for a lot of people, they hear Continental Army, they think, oh, cool, there was already an army right there. Well, no. You have to remember, the colonists were made mostly of shopkeepers, farmers, and merchants. These are not military people. These are not career military men. So for Washington to have a Continental Army, he's going to have to recruit people and say, hey, come into the army and work full time. Now, by the way, working full time, your pay will get you your pay when we can get it to you, but right now, we just need you to fight full time. Guys, that's not an easy recruitment cell. So what's going to happen throughout this war when we talk about the forces fighting the British? We're going to talk about the Continental Army. That would be soldiers who are working full time for the colonists. But we're also going to talk about local militias. Militias, those are shopkeepers, farmers, merchants who have formed their own military unit in the region, the town, the city that they live in. These two, soldiers working full-time, Continental Army, and local militias, are going to work together to fight the British. One last note before we start talking about the battles of the Revolutionary War. We need to know who are the military leaders on each side. Because in any war, there are a lot of different generals and lieutenants, sergeants, admirals, if we're talking about battles at sea. So I'm going to be throwing a lot of names at you pretty fast as we talk about different battles. So to keep there from being any confusion, let's go over the principal military leaders from each side. On the British side, we have General Henry Clinton, General John Burgoyne, General William Howe, and General Charles Cornwallis. On the American colonist side, we have, of course, General George Washington, General Horatio Gates, General Nathaniel Greene, and General Benedict Arnold. So if you hear me say these names, you can always go back if you're confused, look at this part of the video, and you can remember, oh, that guy is the leader of the British side, or oh, that guy is the leader of the American colonists. And of course, as we go through these different battles, I'll try to remind you who is leading what side. Now, the first order of business for the American colonists was to try to keep the British Army in Boston. They didn't want them getting out and being able to go to other parts of the colonies. So the American colonists put cannons on two hills, Bunker Hill and Breed Hill, overlooking Boston. Now, the British Army knew that this was an untenable situation. In other words, we can't operate in Boston if we've got cannons that can fire down from us at any time overlooking the city. So General Howe led his British forces in a frontal assault on those cannons in a battle that we call the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is funny because actually most of the battle took place at Breed's Hill, but it's still called the Battle of Bunker Hill. Go figure. Anyway, the point is, General Howe led his forces in a frontal assault. They were able to remove the cannons from Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, but at a loss of 40% of his assault force. Even though the British won that battle, it was a moral victory for the American colonists, and this actually boosted their confidence. Now, George Washington was not involved in the Battle of Bunker Hill. After all, he had not assumed command yet, and he wouldn't assume command until July 3rd, 1775. But when he did, his assignment was the same: contain the British in Boston. And for a while, both the British and Washington's forces were in a stalemate. But the tide turned in Washington's favor when he received cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga was a British fort in New York that had actually been defeated by a Vermont militia called the Green Mountain Boys. With those cannons, the balance of power changed in Washington's favor, and General Howe was forced to move the British out of Boston, but instead of moving them out of Boston to attack another colony, he had to move them all the way to Halifax. Halifax is the modern-day capital of Nova Scotia in Canada. Howe moved his forces to Halifax and prepared to invade New York in the spring. Washington moved his forces southward to prepare to defend New York in the spring. When it came to New York, the British plan was simple: crush the American Revolution in New York. Crush the American Revolution so it had no possible chance to grow and no possible chance to come back. To that end, the British amassed 34,000 troops, including hired German mercenaries that we call Hessians. Their plan was to not only attack and move the colonists out of New York, but they were going to do it with land troops as well as their navy, which was the best navy in the world at that time. The British plan almost worked, with forces led by General Howe and General Cornwallis. From August 22nd, 1775 to November 24th, 1775, the British absolutely swept through New York, winning in Brooklyn, winning in Manhattan, Long Island, and White Plains, New York. They systematically defeated Washington and his forces no matter where the battles took place. Washington was able to skillfully retreat his forces so that he didn't have to surrender, but they were not able to gain ground against the British, much less defeat them. After defeating and chasing Washington and his forces out of New York, out of New Jersey, across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, winter set in. And you have to remember, in the Northeast, winters are really harsh, and this is the late 1700s. There was no way for the British to continue to fight in massive numbers in winter. They needed to build winter quarters and wait until spring to continue fighting. They did set outposts at Trenton, New Jersey and Bordentown, New Jersey on the Delaware River to keep Washington's forces from coming back. This, ladies and gentlemen, is going to set up one of the most daring sneak attacks in American history. You've probably seen this picture up there. That is George Washington crossing the Delaware. Well, on Christmas Day, 1776, George Washington and 2,400 men decide to cross the ice-filled Delaware River to attack Trenton. Now in Trenton, there was a garrison of Hessians. Now if you remember, Hessians were the German mercenaries that were hired by the British. The Hessians were in charge of the Trenton outpost and were supposed to be looking out for Washington in case he tried to come back. Well, since it was Christmas night, the Hessians had partied just a little bit too hard. Well, they sobered up pretty quickly when Washington and the colonists attacked on Christmas night. Washington and the colonists took over 1,000 Hessians prisoner, which was quite embarrassing for the Hessians and also embarrassing for the British. General Cornwallis took his British troops and came down to Trenton on January 2nd. Washington and his troops had to leave Trenton. They went to Princeton, where they defeated a garrison of British troops at the Battle of Princeton. After that point, Washington and his troops went to Morristown, New Jersey, where they were able to winter there because Morristown was far more defensible. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to remember a lesson of history. It is the little small things, a lot of times, that seem insignificant, that actually have the biggest impact. Now, yes, Princeton and Trenton were not strategic victories for Washington, but they were moral victories for Washington. And it showed the colonists that they could beat the British, and it gave them hope after being absolutely whitewashed in New York. But here's what's more important. Having that hope and keeping the colonist revolution from collapsing will actually allow them to now win a huge victory that will change the course of the war at the Battle of Saratoga. It's now 1777. General Burgoyne is taking his British troops from Canada and bringing them down to join General Howe in New York. General Howe decides, hey, General Burgoyne, since you're coming down, you've got New York, you're good, you don't need me. So Howe goes to Massachusetts, to Chesapeake Bay. He defeats George Washington at the Battle of Brandywine Creek on September 11, 1777. He then goes to Philadelphia and captures Philadelphia on September 25th. George Washington is able to score a victory at the Battle of Germantown on October 4th, but then he has to quarter for the winter in Valley Forge. Now at this point you're probably thinking, wait a second, Mr. McGee, didn't you just say that this was going to be the turning point for the Americans? So far, the British have captured Philadelphia and they defeated Washington at Brandywine Creek, and Washington basically got just one victory. Well, you're forgetting. General Burgoyne has been left in New York. General Burgoyne was making his way down through New York. He had already taken Fort Ticonderoga on July 5th, 1777, pretty easily. His goal was to make it to Albany, New York. From this point forward, General Burgoyne is going to begin to struggle big time. First off, the terrain going to Albany was quite rugged, and that slowed him and his troops down. Also, the American Continental Army, they cut down trees and placed all those trees in the path that Burgoyne had to walk. That actually slowed him down even more. Then on August 16th, he sent the Hessians that were part of his troop, he sent them to Vermont to get more horses. Those Hessians got wiped out in an ambush by the Continental Army. All of this is leading to two fateful battles for General Burgoyne. First, General Burgoyne and his troops run into General Horatio Gates and his Continental Army at Freeman's Farm on September 19th, 1777. Horatio Gates defeats General Burgoyne. Second, on October 7th, 1777, General Burgoyne then runs into Benedict Arnold and his Continental Army, and he's defeated at Bemis Heights. With these two huge losses and no reinforcements coming from New York, because remember, General Howe didn't wait to go with Burgoyne. General Howe already left and is in Philadelphia. With no resources coming in, General Burgoyne is forced to surrender at Saratoga, New York, to the Continental Army. Now, the Battle of Bemis Heights and the Battle of Freeman Farm, together they're called the Battles of Saratoga. Now, why did I say earlier that the Battles of Saratoga are important? Because waiting in the wings are the French. The French have been secretly giving aid and some advice to the colonists, but they haven't come out openly and declared war on the British. Remember, the French are rivals with England. They don't like England. They would love to see England humiliated, because remember, the French got kicked out of North America after the French and Indian War, and revenge is a dish best served cold. And for the French, that dish is called the American colonists, and the French really, really want the American colonists to win. But they also don't want to openly support them if they're not even going to have the ability to defeat the British at all. Once they see the battles of Saratoga and see that General Burgoyne with a huge troop had to surrender to the Americans, the French realize, hey, the Americans can actually win. And all of a sudden, the French openly support the American colonists and then begin to give them their navy and troops. Well, guess what now? Instead of American colonists, who are basically farmers and merchants, fighting the greatest military power in the world, now it's the American colonists, farmers and merchants, along with the second most powerful military in the world versus the most powerful military in the world. Now the American colonists have a chance. If it wasn't for the battles at Saratoga, none of that would be possible. Even though Valley Forge was strategically a great place to winter as 1777 came to a close, Washington estimated that about a third of his troops didn't have shoes. He also estimated that many more didn't have the proper coats for having to sit through a winter in Valley Forge. On top of that, Washington had to write many letters to Congress defending his handling of the troops, asking for more supplies, including shoes and coats. Also, he had to defend himself because there were accusations coming from the capital that Washington was getting a little bit too big for himself, that Washington maybe wanted to be a dictator, to form a coup and overthrow the Congress. Washington had to battle through all these things at Valley Forge without losing hope, and also had to figure out how to boost the morale of his men. Luckily, Washington was able to convince the Continental Congress that not only was he a good general, but he was not trying to become a dictator, and he had no plans of a coup against the Continental Congress. On top of that, the victories at the battles of Saratoga brought in needed allies as well as supplies. Now that we've made it to the point where the French are openly supporting the American colonists, we need to point out the exploits of two Europeans who were instrumental in helping the Americans fight the British. The first is the Marquis de Lafayette. He was a huge supporter of the American Revolution before the French government was willing to support the American Revolution. He actually sailed over to America and fought alongside George Washington at the Battle of Brandywine Creek. He spent the winter in Valley Forge with the American colonists. He worked to support and rally other European officers to help come and train the Continental Army. In short, without his support, without his money, without a lot of the aid that he helped bring over, the Americans would not have won the revolution. The second European is Baron Friedrich von Steuben. He was from Prussia. Now, I said Prussia, not Russia. Prussia is a region of what we now know as Germany. He came over to Valley Forge and became the drill master. He drilled the American Continental Army in Valley Forge on how to use bayonets. Those are those long blades that you put on a rifle. He also taught them how to reform lines in the middle of battle. He drilled and drilled and drilled them so that when they walked out of Valley Forge in June of 1778, they were a far different military from the one that had come in after being defeated at Brandywine Creek. Back in Philadelphia, General Henry Clinton had taken over for General Howe as leader of the British troops in that area. He moved his forces out of Philadelphia with the plan of getting them back to New York. Well, they were met by George Washington's army, a far stronger, more disciplined army than the one that had come into Valley Forge. They battled at Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey, and while the battle was a draw and Clinton was able to make it to New York, Washington was able to stand his ground with his army, and also Clinton realized there was no way from the position that Washington was in that he could defeat Washington at that moment. Now, hold on a second. Before you start thinking, yeah, break out the champagne, it's all over, U.S. wins. It's not going to be that easy. Even though Valley Forge was a great success for Washington and his men, in other areas of the country, especially in the South, things were not going quite well, especially by 1780. The British had already captured Georgia. On May 12, 1780, the British had captured Charleston, South Carolina. By August 16th, General Cornwallis and his troops had crushed Horatio Gates' men at Camden in South Carolina. Worse still, on September 23rd, 1780, General Benedict Arnold committed treason against the Continental Army. He was caught working with a British spy to give away George Washington's position at West Point on the Hudson River. Luckily, Benedict Arnold was caught in time, and he and the British spy were hanged. But that crushed the morale of the British troops to have a man as respected as Benedict Arnold turn on them and join the British. Now don't fear, not all was lost. General Nathaniel Greene took over for Horatio Gates in South Carolina, and he was able to win on January 17, 1781 at the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina. And by the fall of 1781, Greene and his men had pushed Cornwallis up through South Carolina, up through North Carolina, and forced Cornwallis to have to retreat to the peninsula of Yorktown in Virginia. With General Cornwallis and his British troops held up at the Yorktown Peninsula, the final important battle of the American Revolution was about to be fought. George Washington, hearing that Cornwallis was in Yorktown, marched his 14,000 troops down from West Point to Yorktown to fight Cornwallis. Not only that, but the French sent 36 warships under the command of a man named General Jean-Baptiste de Rochambeau to block Cornwallis from being able to escape by sea, and also to block any British ships from being able to resupply Cornwallis and help him out. With Washington's men blocking Cornwallis by land and Rochambeau blocking him by sea, there was nothing Cornwallis could do. And on October 19th, 1781, he surrendered to Washington. The Battle of Yorktown and Cornwallis' surrender effectively ended the American Revolution. There would still be battles on and off for the next year and a half, but no side really gained an advantage, and the British definitely did not gain the advantage that they needed. Eventually, negotiators from Britain and what we now know as America came together, and the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3rd, 1783. The American colonists had done the impossible. They defeated the greatest military power in the world. They were officially free and had become the United States of America. George Washington, for his part, wanted nothing more than to go back to Mount Vernon after the war was over and retire in peace as a farmer. But he would be called on a few more times. But we'll talk about that in the next video. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them politely and respectfully in the comments section below. I'm Mr. McGee. Take care.